Should we put the QR code back up so that new joiners can scan, do you think? Great, thank you. Afternoon, folks. We're just waiting for colleagues to continue joining. In the meantime, to keep you amused, this is the North of England Senate Development Day. So thank you for joining. But in the meantime, if you're in need of amusement, please get your mobile phone out, turn the camera on, and it should take you to the website if you scan the QR code for you to put an answer into just a one question, which is what you expect to get from today's meeting. And then we'll put the answers up shortly. So good afternoon, everybody. We'll get cracking, I think. I'm sure other colleagues will join. We have 43 on the call. My name is Martin Vernon. I'm the chair of the North West Clinical Senate, and this is the North of England Joint Clinical Senate's Development Day. It's one of 2 days, so welcome to the first event, which is online, obviously, and really appreciate you joining us this afternoon. As we're waiting for 1 or 2 more colleagues to join, just over the next few minutes, we'll in a moment again flash up. We're using Mentimeter. For those not familiar with this, it's a QR code. You can scan it on your mobile phone, should take you to a website, and you can then tell us what you think about what you expect from the day, and we'll try and display those answers. So that's the QR code to scan in, or you can go to the website and just put the numerical code in. Takes just a few seconds. And then at the end of this event today, we'll come back with some further questions for you to offer thoughts, comments and feedback in the same way. So hopefully that makes sense. We're still getting used to this technology, so all technological failures I will firmly take responsibility for as the chair of the North West Senate, in the background helping to run some of this, and particularly Sarah, who is our tech guru at this end. So we'll get cracking. There are nearly 50 people on the call, and first of all, thank you to the 3 North of England Senate's management teams, in particular Caroline, Jeanette, Sarah and Pam, who are in the background keeping us in good order. Just a reminder for colleagues around Teams etiquette. I'm sure we don't need this after 3 years online over the last few years working through the pandemic, but please keep yourself on mute. We have the mute police checking you out just in case you forget, if not talking. If you do wish to say something during one of the sessions that we can talk to each other, please raise hands, and we'll try and marshal that accordingly. In the meantime, please feel free to put comments, thoughts, reactions into the chat as per usual. We are recording this event purely to capture all of the valuable, rich content that we will be generating over the next couple of hours. So hopefully you are in agreement with that. So I am joined by my two colleagues who chair the other two North of England Senates. We have for the last 2 years formed a very strong alliance across the North between the three clinical senates, which is set out in a memorandum of understanding, which was reviewed again at the end of last year. And I think it's fair to say this reflects a very productive and healthy relationship we have in the North of England between the senates, which has again added to the value and richness of what we undertake. For those who are new to Senate work, this is an opportunity to learn a little bit more. It's also for those who are well established in the world of senates. This is an opportunity for us to offer you something back in terms of learning and development. We do very much value everybody's commitment to participation in Senate activities. The standard line here, which remains firmly true, is that the clinical senates are a trusted and highly cost-effective source of independent objective advice, particularly focused around service transformation and offering statutory assurance where this is required to NHS England and to commissioners. Just to go back to the original quote from Bruce Keogh when the senates were established statutorily some years ago, anybody who undertakes major change programs without taking wise counsel would do to consider why they are not taking such wise counsel, and that is really our core purpose, is to be formative and to offer assurance where that's required. We have an absolute stellar cast of contributors this afternoon. My fellow chairs will introduce themselves as we go along, but in advance of all of that, thanks to Andrew and to Chris for taking us through the afternoon, and I will pick up again at the end to try and collect thoughts together. I don't know whether we've got any more on the Mentimeter, just to set out for everybody what we're expecting. Sarah, I don't really want to.
We've got a couple of questions at the end. So we'll put the QR code back on then.
Okay. Yeah.
Thanks.
So just a few further comments from myself, and then we'll crack on. These are indeed troubled times, I think it's fair to say. We have just come through probably the worst winter that the NHS has seen. We are in the process of undergoing significant transformation with the emergence of integrated care systems, the new language of commissioning around integrated care boards and provider collaboratives. The senates remain firmly in the centre of any major transformational change processes, and I personally, and I think my co-chairs would agree, that the Senate function remains absolutely crucial as we take the NHS forwards. So all participation from all colleagues in this is absolutely crucial to our continued function. And in particular, from my own perspective, I think the things that we are really keen to know about and to be involved in is the transformational work as ICSs take shape and the new commissioning functions start to take root. Inevitably, all of these changes will, over time, generate more work for the senates, hence the need for a very productive and strong collaboration across the North in particular. The other key issue, two key issues for me are around workforce. As I say, we're in troubled times at the moment. I won't draw your attention to the emerging headlines at the moment, but I think it's fair to say that workforce is central to any change programme and something that we very much need to keep centre. The NHS would not function without its people. And then my final comment is that, again, in the north in particular, and particularly along the northwest coast, actually from my own Senate, we are very focused on trying to address disparities, and particularly having this centre field when we're considering review work. So hopefully those core themes will in some way chime with you as we go through the rest of the afternoon. Without further ado, I'm going to pass on to Chris, who I think is going to take us, sorry, Andrew, who's going to take us through the next segment with Yvette. So over to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Martin. I'm delighted to be here and delighted that we have so many people joining us. And I suppose the only thing I'd like to say to add to the very good things Martin has said is just how much we value our clinical Senate council and the people who take reviews. It's work done over and above, and the quality of our reviews, I think, is very strongly dependent on the quality of the people who give of their time and expertise. So thank you. And thank you too now to Yvette, who's given of her time and expertise, and I think has truly gone over and above, having had a very busy life as a paediatrician and then as a medical director at Leeds. She took on the COVID vaccine work, and her reward was to become medical director of NHS England, northeastern Yorkshire. And she's still doing it. Yvette, I think it's wonderful. And I've really enjoyed our interactions. You've been very supportive. You have lots of insight, and you have a wonderful perspective of what's going on, and within that, what matters and what perhaps isn't so important. At least that's my impression from our conversations. So we're very much looking forward to hear what you've got to say in the next 10 minutes or so. Over to you, Yvette. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Andrew, and hello, everybody. There are quite a few faces and names that I recognise that perhaps I didn't really understand or had clocked that you were part of the Senate. So it's lovely to see people who I have worked with in the past, some of whom were very young when I first met them, and now, like me, are more mature. As you've said, Andrew, I feel a little bit like the poacher that has turned gamekeeper by working now for NHS England. And it's been quite enlightening for me, but what I hope that I have brought into this role is a perspective that comes from acute care, but also not just from a teaching hospital background, but also from a district general hospital background. And I have been lucky enough to work in different parts of the region. The Northeast less so, but I'm definitely learning much more about the Northeast. I think it's exactly, I was just thinking, oh, it's 3 years since lockdown started. And I thought I'll just Google, when did lockdown start? And it was the 23rd of March, 2020. So we're exactly 3 years to the day since we first went into that enormous lockdown. And I don't know about all the rest of you, but I thought that a pandemic might last 12, 18 months. I didn't realise that at the time, though I should, that the impact of the pandemic would go on and on and on. And I think we have heard, 5 years might be about the timescale in which you would recover from a pandemic. So we're halfway through, perhaps a bit more than halfway through now, but we've still got time to go. And it feels like, having worked in the NHS 39 years this year, I don't think it has ever been as challenging as it is at the moment. Martin mentioned he wasn't going to say anything about the breaking news, but the contemplation of 4 days of junior doctor industrial action straight after a 4-day bank holiday is absolutely dismal, and it's going to cause so many problems. And I am really concerned about whether or not we will have sufficient consultant workforce to cover that period of time, and then the impact beyond that is absolutely massive. So but that's not what I came to talk to you about and came to say. So I think the setup in the 12 months that I've been working with NHS England in this role, we've had the setup of ICBs. I think across our region, we are relatively lucky that we went for big ICBs, and we have 4 in the northeastern Yorkshire and 3 over in the northwest. So each of our ICBs is of a good size, and each of them has a range of providers to deliver care to their populations. But we are definitely in a phase where we've got some, storming, forming and norming. And I think we're still in the forming phase in relation to how we work with NHS England and the ICBs. We're lucky in so much as we've got Richard Barker now being our regional director for all of us. And Richard's way of working has been to be very collaborative with ICBs, but actually the oversight framework for NHS England puts NHS England as overseeing ICBs and ICBs overseeing organisations, unless those provider organisations are basically out with their provider licence, i.e. they are so challenged that they should be having either regional or national oversight. And as you can imagine, I know that you will all know that it's a bit like a game of whack-a-mole, where you just sort out one problem and something else pops up. And we have a number of organisations who have struggled for a long time, but where they have started to make real improvements. And equally, we have some organisations that have always been doing very well, had light touch in terms of oversight, who are now beginning to struggle. So we're trying to work our way around those relationships. How do we work with ICBs? How do ICBs work with providers? And how do we avoid a lot of duplication and stepping on each other's toes? So I think that the focus of ICBs being on what is it their population needs, how can their providers work together to deliver that, and in particular a much bigger focus now on primary and community services, because to be honest, hospitals are full and they're full to busting, and there isn't room for them to keep expanding. So I hope the more collaborative way of working, and the way therefore so one of the ways do you get providers to collaborate is to make sure that the big money comes in to the system rather than to individuals. So capital, big amounts of capital going to ICBs, ICBs prioritising where does that capital go is one of the ways of doing that. So you know, that's how we are settling in. On top of that, of course, NHS England is significantly slimming down, but it is also coming together with Health Education England, NHS Digital, NHS X. So we're a bit inwardly focused at the moment in NHS England, looking at our own structures and having to make a significant headcount reduction and a significant financial reduction. ICBs have also had a letter very recently telling them they're going to have to do the same thing. because they are a collaboration of all the CCGs coming together, and equally they need to look at what resources they need in order to deliver their functions. You know, you mentioned, Martin, workforce issues. That is our biggest challenge, and I think system working maybe stops us thinking about, you know, how one organisation can put the banding up of nurse endoscopists, and all that means is they move from one organisation to the next, and looking at how we get a more collaborative approach with providers to stop that kind of thing happening. But also, how do we train future workforce, and how do we retain and recruit them? I think in terms of some of the positive changes that are happening, you know, we've started a programme of virtual wards. I think there's been a fair amount of cynicism about what virtual wards can do. I think many organisations had already started with virtual wards, whether we called them that or not. They might have been an outpatient waiting list in some cases, but now use of technology to remotely monitor patients whilst they're at home is going to help us to develop services, because right now delayed discharges and inappropriate admissions due to you know, the lack of availability of social care is going to, you know, is a real challenge. So the virtual wards are one element of, and remote and use of remote technology are one of the things that we have been working on significantly this year. But I think perhaps more exciting is what other kind of digital technologies can help us. So particularly things that are classed as artificial intelligence. And right now, one of our most significant challenges is non-surgical oncology. So we are desperately short of non-surgical oncologists. We have services that are on the precipice of a crisis, because we've got demographic changes with more people being diagnosed with cancer, more treatments being available for cancer, and better survival of cancer patients. But we've also got a workforce crisis in our non-surgical oncologists. So where can artificial intelligence start to help us? We're seeing some of that in radiology, and we're seeing it perhaps in some of the radiotherapy planning tools that might be available. So that doesn't help non-surgical oncology, but I think we are going to have to look for those kinds of solutions, because workforce is going to remain a significant challenge for us. So I think I don't want to overrun my time, Martin, and I know you've got plenty of other really excellent speakers coming along. But it is a very challenging time, and how we actually support colleagues together and look after their well-being is a really important thing for us all to focus on. The Senate, in my role already, I have found the Senate really helpful, both Andrew and Chris, as great colleagues, but also the work that the Senates have done for us. I think, you know, it's more important than ever that we involve clinicians in decisions that need to be taken, whether that is about changes in services in terms of where they sit, or whether it's actually about the transformation of a service. What can be done by optometrists that is currently done by ophthalmologists? What can be done by audiology that is currently done by ENT, are just a couple of those examples. And that's where I think our Senates can really help us to engage clinicians and patients, so that we make decisions together that we get buy-in for and are beneficial for our patients and our populations. So thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Yvette. I'm sure there are millions of questions we'd like to ask, but actually I think, given our time and the nature of what we're doing, I think we won't have questions at this time. We've got space for discussion later on. But Yvette, thank you very much, and thank you for all you do supporting us and for your kind words. So I think our work has often a very downward focus. We're responding to the needs that come to us from people and groups within our region, but it's also been very important to know the direction of travel nationally. And on several occasions, I've really appreciated discussions that we've had with Johnny Williams, our next speaker, who is involved in the system transformation team nationally. And so without any further ado, Johnny, I'm going to hand over to you to ask you to tell us about this from a national perspective. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Hi, everyone. Lovely to see you all. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Johnny Williams. I am the Senior Programme Manager for Service Change in the System Transformation team at NHS England. I recognise quite a few faces from some of the work that we do nationally, so it's lovely to see lots of you again. And thank you very much for having me today. I'm going to go through my presentation. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to go as quickly as I can and hopefully have some time at the end to wrap up anything that wasn't clear. But as Andrew said, I want to start today by giving you a bit of an introduction to my team and what we do. I think it's very common for NHS England to arrive to meetings like this with an assumption that we all know how the organisation works, which is very rarely true because we're a very convoluted organisation. I'm not going to touch on the second section too much because you all have the privilege of hearing Gerard later on today talk about service change and legislation, but I am going to spend a bit of time talking about the process of major service change which clinical senates are involved in and what the role of regional clinical senates is, and then finally touch upon the wider sort of support that we offer as a team in NHS England. So the System Transformation team is part of a directorate at NHS England called the Chief Delivery Officer Directorate. The directorate's role is to provide support both to the organisation but to systems as well. And a large part of that is supporting with large-scale transition and change. We've mentioned it already today, but the most notable of which is the establishment of integrated care systems back on the 1st of July last year. So myself and my team have worked quite closely with systems to develop the policy and guidance for that, and we still continue to do so. The aspect of our ambitions that this work is specifically related to is the kind of direct support we like to provide to systems to understand what are essentially very complicated processes, such as going through a major service change programme. So myself and my team work very closely with systems on that regard. We work very closely with other teams at NHS England, some of whom you'll have heard of before. There is a team called Provider Development. They own the oversight and coordination of national service change, specifically those changes that require a level of national assurance, and I'll get into that a little bit later on. They're also the point of contact for the Department of Health and Social Care when it comes to policy decisions around major service change. And they do a lot of the reporting both from systems and to the executive team at NHS England. We also have some fantastic regional teams, and I'm sure your heads of regional clinical senates are very tied into those regional teams. They are, I like to say, the doers when it comes to providing support and assurance to service change. They're really kind of getting stuck in on the process of assuring pre-consultation business cases, for instance. And then you have ourselves in the system transformation team. So I just want to touch very briefly to sort of set the wider context of service change, and Gerard is absolutely going to do a better job of explaining this than I am right now, but I just want to show you all that there are a number of really key legal duties for any organisation that's going through major service change, or what's sort of in law referred to as substantial variation. And all of those are in order to ensure that the way that we provide frontline services for patients and the public is the best that it can be, involves the people that are affected by it, and involves those who are ultimately also democratically accountable for it. In general, we describe these duties as the duty to involve patients and the public, the duty on organisations to reduce inequalities, and the duty to consult the local authority. I'll point out later on where these fall sort of in the service change process, but they are really fundamental legal duties. They are often those often the things that commissioners and organisations are referred on the basis of to either the Secretary of State or as part of the judicial review. And of course, there's the Equality Act, which underpins any kind of public sector activity, including the public sector equality duty. The specific thing related to legislation that I was asked to talk about today are new regulations that are coming into effect as a result of last year's Health and Care Act. But I want to flip this slide on its head a little bit and point to the box at the bottom first, because it's really important that I mention that the regulations in the Health and Care Act that are new in relation to major service change have not yet commenced. They haven't formally been laid down, which means that these aren't yet in effect, but they are significant changes to the current process for undertaking major service change. The first of which is going to be a duty of notification. So this is going to require the Commissioner of a major service change to notify the Secretary of State for any new proposals around major service change. That, as a result, gives new powers to the Secretary of State. So it's being called to or referred as a call-in power at the moment, which is to be determined in terms of the scope, but allows the Secretary of State sort of more direct access to these programmes of change. And finally, there's an interrelated power that has an impact on service change, which is being called the catalyst power. This may, but is not yet to be determined, give the Secretary of State the power, for instance, to make considered requests around reconfiguring services as a result of pressures or as a result of failure to agree within a local system. So that's the kind of context setting. I want to talk now a little bit about assuring service change and the role that the Regional Clinical Senate play in that. And I want to start by showing you what anyone who has gone through the process of service change, and I'm sure Rachel will attest to this later on, is an incredibly simplified timeline for a service change programme, but hopefully kind of gives you the most simplistic overview of what service change looks like in reality. I'd like to also say that 16 months is an incredibly optimistic timeline, but hopefully some schemes manage to get through at that point. This is in essence what service change looks like on a page, and it starts with understanding your case for change, understand why you're making that change in the first place, and it goes all the way through to implementing that change. For the purposes of the Regional Clinical Senate, it's really important to focus on those three beginning stages, which is the case for change, the pre-consultation work that you do, and if it is a formal service change that requires public consultation, the consultation itself. So those are the generic stages of a service change programme. Each stage within it has a significant amount of work required that goes into it, legal duties, as I've mentioned, and extensive stakeholder engagement, not least with yourselves as the Clinical Senate. Because it's so extensive, it also means that there's a significant amount of assurance that goes into that. So we like to say that there are kind of 5 main assurance stages. And apologies, I should have written this acronym out in full, but that's assuring a pre-consultation business case. So the first formally assured business case that commissioners and systems will have to write to go to public consultation for any proposals on service change. So the first one, I hope you'll be happy to see, is yourselves in the Regional Clinical Senate. NHS England has 4+1 tests for major service change, one of which is a clear clinical evidence base. And it's imperative for any commissioner to be able to demonstrate that proposals to change frontline services have a clear clinical rationale. And that's where the clinical senate comes in, to be able to provide an independent voice and an independent process of feedback to proposals that ensures not just NHS England, but all the stakeholders that are involved in planning and delivering service change, that this rationale makes sense, that it's better for the public and better for patients, and that it works from a clinical point of view. The local authority also plays a role in assuring service change. So each local authority will have a health overview scrutiny committee, which is made up of elected councillors. It is a legal duty for healthcare commissioners to engage that committee. That committee may decide, in agreement with the commissioner, that what is being proposed constitutes substantial variation. So a significant shift to the way that healthcare services are currently being delivered. I always wish that I could present you with a list of what those might actually be, but unfortunately there's so much diversity that it's very difficult to determine exactly what constitutes substantial variation. Sometimes a HOSC may agree that there's only one viable solution to a current issue, and that therefore what's being proposed by a commissioner doesn't constitute substantial variation and therefore doesn't require public consultation. Other times, commissioners may go to their local HOSC with what they consider to be a very insignificant change. For example, moving a single ward from one acute site to another within a trust. But that HOSC may deem that to be a substantial variation and therefore requiring public consultation. It's really important during this process of seeking assurance that ongoing stakeholder engagement plays a really fundamental part right from the beginning of this process of determining your vision and your case for change. Depending on the scale of the change that you're proposing, you'll then have regional and or national assurance. This is assessed against NHSE's guidance on planning, assuring and delivering service change. The regional process is made up of 2 stages, the first being a strategic sense check, and the second being a slightly more formal approval of the PCBC to go back to the ICB or the decision-making body to formally sign off that business case. So just touching very briefly on the role of the clinical senate in all of this, this is a bit of a bird's eye view of the process between confirming a case for change and getting that sign off on the pre-consultation business case. And I've highlighted in the red box here where we always say to systems, you in the regional clinical senate should come in. I can't say whether or not this happens in all cases, and I'm sure your heads of clinical senates might have a view on when this happens, but we often tell systems the best time to engage a regional clinical senate is as soon as possible. You're obviously volunteering your time, your incredible expertise, and it's so vitally important that you're able to plan that accordingly. Reviewing a pre-consultation business case is no mean feat and can't quite be done overnight. So we always say that when systems are developing the strategy that will form the basis of their service change proposals, it's at that point that the regional clinical senate should be engaged to discuss options for reviewing and providing independent advice to those proposals. There'll then be a stage where the system goes through the development of their options. In one of our modules for learning and development, we have a fantastic sort of diagram that demonstrates the funnel that helps systems to determine viable options, thinking, for instance, about the viability of their clinical model of care, thinking about fixed criteria such as capital availability, estates and the like. And then they'll get to a stage of appraising those options and shortlisting them into the ones that they would want to take out to the public to consult on. All of that process, all of that engagement, all of that work would be documented within the pre-consultation business case. And then we would ordinarily say you wouldn't go past stage 2 regional assurance without getting confirmation from the clinical senate that this would meet the test for having a clear clinical evidence base. So it may be that the system has to come back to you if your report finds that it doesn't, or that there are questions or issues to raise, and that begins an iterative process until the Regional Clinical Senate is satisfied. So just touching very briefly on the pre-consultation business case itself. Very simply, it's a Word document. It's often a very, very detailed Word document. So you may see some, or you may see all of it, that sets out, in essence, the life cycle of the programme of change that the system has been through. It is a formal document. It's signed off by the Integrated Care Board that's responsible for that change, and it becomes the basis on which systems go out to public consultation, which means that it also becomes the legal document which becomes scrutinised. So we often say to systems that it's incredibly important to make that document as detailed and as well evidenced as possible. Showing, for instance, how you've engaged with the Regional Clinical Senate and how you've adapted proposals on the basis of their feedback is vitally important to be able to demonstrate in a legal setting the clinical viability, for instance. It isn't, however, the formal document that you give to the public. It is publicly made available through the Health Overview Scrutiny Committee, which are public boards with public papers. So it's really important to be mindful of that. But it's not the consultation document itself. That would be produced separately. It's also, much to the chagrin of many of my system colleagues, not the final business case when it comes to driving service change. It's one of many, and that's because many of these service changes require significant shifts to the way that healthcare is delivered, so require a significant amount of assurance and a significant amount of evidence that this is the right direction. So once a PCBC is finished, once consultation is finished, and if capital is required for the change, the system would then go through a process of capital business case development. And finally, just to say, we speak about this in detail on our programme, it isn't a report either, so it isn't an epistolary. It's a well-crafted document that it should be able to provide you as regional clinical senates with the information that you need, provide regional NHSE colleagues with the information that they need, and then stand up to legal scrutiny. So finally, as I've mentioned before, and just to cover off this slide very quickly, clinical backing for the proposals that are the backbone of a PCBC are fundamental, and systems know that the best way to get that backing is through yourselves in the Regional Clinical Senate, which is why we have this process of engaging the senates during the development of service change proposals. It needs to meet the 5 tests for service change, and as I say that out loud, I'm kicking myself for not having double checked them before the start of this meeting, because I can definitely remember 3 off the top of my head, but the other 2 are definitely going to escape me. But they are the 5 assurance tests, one of which is the bed test. So if your proposals are amending the number of beds available, then you need to be able to demonstrate that capacity is sought elsewhere or can be filled elsewhere, or that there are clinical interventions that reduce the need for that capacity. Really important to say that the HOSC, the local authority, don't sign off the PCBC, but they are shown the PCBC. They should be shown the PCBC. And as I mentioned before, the PCBC becomes a public document through that engagement with the HOSC. And just to say finally, this is a very complicated landscape in terms of the responsibility and ownership of service change. Any service change has to be driven by the Commissioner. The PCBC is a Commissioner-owned document because the Commissioner is the legal body responsible for the duties that I mentioned before, and therefore they need to own the pre-consultation business case and do this formal engagement. Often we know, and I'm sure you're aware in your roles, that the need for change is derived commonly from providers who identify risks or pressures that require change. It's really important as a programme to work arm in arm almost, but it is also fundamental that the Commissioner acknowledge their role as the formal owners of this business case and seek support from providers through things like letters of assurance. Just touching really briefly before I move on to support and any questions, there are different thresholds for schemes to be assured. I mentioned earlier that there are regional assurance processes and national assurance processes. I think I'm right in saying, though Richard, with his extensive experience, may be able to correct me, that any kind of service change proposal, regardless of the level of capital involved, would have to go to a level of regional assurance to go through to public consultation. But there are a number of factors to consider when understanding the context of the proposal that you're working in. So I won't go through this slide in detail, but anything that incurs a significant level of capital, anything that is affecting what we call distressed health economy, so a provider in SOF 4, for instance, or anything that requires a level of capital support from NHS England for the transition, will incur different levels of assurance as well. Which leads me quite well into the support that we provide in the system transformation team, because I've probably made it sound like an incredibly convoluted and complicated process, and I do my system colleagues a disservice by pretending that it isn't. It really is. But we've been trying to develop as many support products and interventions as possible to simplify this process and to share information about the best ways of doing it. The first one of which is, I hope many of you will be aware of, an interactive handbook for major service change. This is an 84-page PDF document that takes systems through the how-to of service change, all the way from understanding what you need to do at the beginning to understand your drivers and your case for change, all the way through to evaluating the implementation that you've gone through as a result of this programme. It's replete with top tips, with Q&As, with case studies and key documents. So I would really recommend the title on this slide is a hyperlink to the handbook itself, which is on our Future NHS workspace, and you'll get these slides after. So we would really recommend having a look at that if you haven't already. We also have a learning and development programme for major service change. And again, I'm going to point to the big red box before getting into any of the detail of this. We've been delivering the programme for 2.5 years now. Myself and a few colleagues put it together, commissioned it out to experts by experience who deliver it. And our ability to continue delivering this is going to be dependent on budget availability in the next financial year. As Yvette mentioned at the start, we are going through a significant change programme at the minute as a result of the need to cut down on staff numbers, but also kind of as a result of the wider context that we work in. So unfortunately, this programme isn't guaranteed next year, but we are really hoping to get the financial support to be able to deliver it. This again breaks down what we consider to be some of the fundamental aspects of successful service change. Most relevant to you perhaps is the clinical engagement process. And I know Caroline has been on this course and hopefully can vouch for how important we say it is to engage with people like yourselves, both as clinicians, but also as the Regional Clinical Senate as well. A new intervention this year that we'll be driving forward is a national learning network for major service change. So we are going to be putting on quarterly meetings as an opportunity for those of you who work in service change to get together, to collaborate, to ask questions, to network with your peers, and also to hear from other systems. We hear time and time again that systems really benefit from hearing about this in practice, and we've already had Rachel talk to us before as part of our regional engagement, and it's just fantastic to see this brought to life. There's lots of learning there, so we're hopefully formalising that offer this year. And we also have focus groups. Co-production is really important to us as a team that delivers support, and it feels redundant to develop products without the extensive involvement of those that are going to receive that product. So anything that we deliver or that we design, we hope to do hand in hand with systems and with colleagues such as yourself. And then finally, we have a Future NHS workspace. It feels a little bit like it or love it. If you're a team in NHS England, you've got to have one of these workspaces. But I have to say, we've done loads of really hard work this year, kind of redesigning this to be a helpful, navigable, place that people who are interested in major service change can go to see all of the formal guidance, all of the research around service change, all of the case studies we have, as well as any of the events, including the network session and the learning and development programme I mentioned, listed there as well. And that little QR code will take you straight to that workspace. It is hosted by Future NHS, and you may have found it a bit difficult to access that site before. This is open to join, but you do need a Future NHS account to be able to join it. And of course, if there are any problems with that, but you are interested in joining, do please drop me a line and I'm happy to kind of make that happen. So that is my presentation. I'm very, very happy. I think I managed to make us up on time there. But really very happy to take any questions or comments that you might have. And I apologise, I wasn't able to keep track of the chat at the same time, but if there's anything there, I'm happy to pick that up too.
Johnny, thank you so much. You covered a lot of ground in a very calm, unhurried fashion. And just to echo what I think is coming up in the chat, that a lot of people do find the resource and materials you have mentioned extremely helpful. And as others have done, I would strongly commend them. On the chat box, Jeanette has kindly put up the 5 tests, plus the one about beds. And of course, as you say there, the clear clinical evidence base is part of that. I think we've got time for 2 or 3 quick, concise questions about Johnny's presentation. Can we focus them on Johnny's presentation? There are many other things we could discuss, but I think we need to keep to time. So questions about Johnny's presentation, please. Sorry, I've just lost.
It's Willie Pillay.
Okay, Willie, please. You may be muted. We can't hear you, Willie.
Willie posted in the chat itself asking what the abbreviation of IRG is. What does it stand for, please, Johnny?
Oh, yes, sorry, apologies. Acronym central over in NHS England. I really do have to stop myself from doing that. The IRG is the Independent Reconfiguration Group, and it's actually been updated now to the EIG, and much like my lack of 5 test knowledge, I really should have come prepared with an acronym buster. The EIG is made up of executives from NHS England who provide approvals for high-level national assurance requirements. So people like Julian Kelly and others in Chris Hobson in the Strategy Directorate, for instance. So that kind of level in NHS England.
Thank you.
Sorry, I got cut off there. Can you hear me now, Andrew?
Yes.
Sorry. You said, Johnny, that in the new Act, the Secretary of State would need to be informed of any new proposals. Is there a threshold, or is it really any reconfiguration of services across the board? Because that seems quite a lot.
It does, yes, yeah, and it's a really pertinent question to ask, Willie. I think the detail of that is being worked out in the department at the moment, understanding what the threshold would be for an acceptable reconfiguration to notify the Secretary of State of. I'm pretty sure that changing the candles from lavender to vanilla in the GP surgery isn't going to count as a major service change, but we'll see.
And sorry, apologies. There was a comment that Jeanette put in about the 4 tests of service change. Can you just clarify the one about bed reduction? Is the intention that there should be a bed reduction or not a bed reduction, or the bed should be the same? What's the ask in terms of that?
It's for any service change that includes a reduction in the number of beds. So not all service changes will be about beds, but if they are about beds, then the system has to be able to demonstrate that there is capacity elsewhere in the system to compensate for the lack, or that there are sufficient new medical interventions that reduce the need for that capacity.
Thank you.
I'm really sorry. I know other people want to ask questions, but I think we're not going to stay to time. Johnny, thank you so much. That was really very helpful.
Thank you,
so our next speaker is Richard Jeevons, who, picking up Yvette's comment, if anyone's been poacher and gamekeeper, I'd suggest it was you, Richard. Is it not true? But I think that gives you a unique perspective, and your work on the independent reconfiguration panel will take us on from what Johnny's presented to how complicated and tricky this sometimes becomes. And so without further ado, I'd like to hand over to you to talk to us more about the overview of the IRP's work. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, everybody, for inviting me. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Excellent, good. Somebody's controlling my slides for me. I'm speaking to you from the far north end of the Isle of Lewis, and it's amazing how good the technology is up here. It'll now fail in the next couple of minutes, I'm sure. Yeah, I'm going to pick up really where Johnny left off and tell the story of major service change from the perspective of the independent reconfiguration panel, and therefore from the perspective of the Secretary of State over many years. Next slide, please. For those who don't know, the independent reconfiguration panel was set up 20 years ago by Alan Milburn. It must be one of the few government bodies that has survived virtually unchanged in health for 20 years. Its terms of reference have been modified and updated as new policy and legislation has been introduced, but fundamentally it remains there as an advisory body to the Secretary of State when they need help with contested or disputed or controversial NHS service changes. The fundamental format of the IRP hasn't changed that much. The members are public appointees appointed by the Secretary of State, approved by Downing Street, which I think gives an insight into the sensitivity of some of the issues that come across the desk. Current chairman is Sir Norman Williams, formerly President of the Royal College of Surgeons. And we have a panel made up of equal numbers of clinical, lay and managerial. That's entirely a deliberate design from day one in order to get the different perspectives and tensions involved in discussion about what makes a good service and what makes a service work for patients and our public. Apart from myself part-time, we have a Secretary, Fiona Gannon, details at the end of the slides. Next slide, please. We have two roles in our terms of reference. The first is to advise the Secretary of State on contested proposals. That is contested by scrutiny committees. As John has explained, towards the end of the process, there are powers of referral, and they still exist, even though we have a new Act from 2022. Our informal role is to participate in events like this and to share information, promote the sharing of knowledge and experience in the field of service change. And over the years, I've collaborated with many people on this call and indeed my colleagues who are speaking on similar events. I'm delighted to say that my first chairman, Peter Barrett's objective, which was to see the IRP out of business as a result of people developing and learning how to do this stuff really well, it hasn't quite been achieved, but there's been huge progress, and I'll touch on that again. And one of the reasons for the progress is that people do reflect and learn and weigh evidence and collaborate in how to do this better. No more so than I must say the clinical senates and NHS England over the last few years, where both have really stood up and filled some of the gaps that were so obvious before. Next slide, please. The formal role is, as I've mentioned, directly related to the powers of local authorities to scrutinise NHS decisions about service change and to refer their concerns to the Secretary of State, either where they've not been consulted adequately, for example, where the NHS changes something without even talking to the scrutiny committee and they feel they should have been consulted, or indeed under a very generic heading where they believe that what is proposed is not in the interests of health services. That phrase, a bit like the phrase substantial developmental variation, is almost written to allow anything to be referred to the Secretary of State where the politics of local scrutiny determine it should be. And as a result, the Secretary of State has seen everything from the closure of a GP practice in Witney, Oxfordshire, to the future configuration of congenital heart disease services across England. The Secretary of State doesn't have to ask the IRP for advice when he receives such a referral, but actually they tend to. As long as the referral meets the regulatory requirements, they tend to ask us. And the IRP has historically delivered advice in 20 working days. And as people who complain about the IRP and how it slows down progress, I refer my 20 working days to Johnny's 16 months optimistic timetable for a service change programme. We occasionally ask the Secretary of State for more time to investigate further, but in the last few years we've only done that once. Next slide, please. The formal role has evolved since 2008, and in 2013, when the NHS was last subjected to a major reorganisation, there were some changes to the regulations relating to reconfiguration and scrutiny. I'll concentrate what I say now on evidence since then. We've looked at over 30 cases, and what normally happens is that the referral comes in, the Secretary of State writes to us, and then we effectively do a review after the facts based on every single piece of evidence that anybody is willing to give us about what is proposed. And interestingly, latterly, for example, clinical Senate reports have proved to be critical pieces of evidence in that jigsaw of after the facts review. I can't overemphasize how important the work that clinical senates do on this is in all this, as does the assurance process that John has outlined. Every single one of the documents he's mentioned get a forensic review as part of this process. Only 3 of those 30 were actually failing to consult, were on the grounds of failing to consult with the scrutiny committee. The other 27 were, we don't like the answer, not in the interest. Only 1 required more than 20 working days. And just to make a point, we advise the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of State decides what to do. It's not a legal process. In fact, it is a process that can be subject to legal challenge. So the Secretary of State and the IRP's advice, just like the work of NHS commissioners, is subject to challenge and legal scrutiny. We've had 1 Secretary of State decision threatened with a challenge, which fell at the first hurdle. Next slide, please. Looking back over the entire 20 years, we've advised the Secretary of State over 80 times. By the way, every single piece of advice is published. There's a link at the end of the presentation to follow if you want to go and read all our advice. And we first distilled learning from our work 15 years ago. And we've revisited it regularly since then. And although context has changed as policy, government and so forth has changed, actually the themes have persisted. And we summarise it in what we call 7 critical success factors. These are the things that if people really keep in mind, they're less likely to fall over. Next slide, please. In these 7 factors, there's a huge, and there has become an increasing emphasis on involvement. And open community and stakeholder involvement throughout is absolutely crucial to success. Context. If you're proposing a change to a service, the obvious question is, so how does this fit in with this related service? And if you haven't got context in which you're proposing change, you very quickly get into an explanatory debate with stakeholders that takes up time and sometimes leads to trouble. Regrettably, there's a political rhetoric around this is all about cuts. I won't be able to get there, or I'll be dead before I arrive. Money, transport and emergency care. Even if the services aren't directly related to that, you've got to be prepared to deal with the things that jump to the front of people's minds straight away. Here's where clinical senates play a critical role in assurance and formative work. There has to be a credible case for change. And it has to be one that clinicians and patients will actually stand up and advocate. Not that a few people think is a good idea, but actually stand up and advocate. Next slide. And then the benefits of what's proposed need to be articulated and communicated, and in a way that means something to the people who use the services and provide the services. There has to be a plan for implementation. Johnny mentioned capital. I mean, we've had cases where people have done huge amounts of work over many years, and then the question's asked, well, will you have the capital to finance the change? Oh, well, we don't know yet. I mean, that just knocks a hole in your boat, really, and sends it down the river. So you've got to have a view about how you'll implement and how to proceed, which passes the test of stakeholders. And critically, and most importantly, and this is important for legal and other purposes as well, transparency from beginning to end, so that the consultation is meaningful and people's responses to consultation are given proper consideration before a decision. I mean, that's a standard administrative law test, but it's actually a critical behavioural test as well in service change. Next slide, please. I've got a couple of slides here. One is to look back and one is to look forward. So the first is, and I've sort of buttered you up already, the NHS has got better at this. Much better at it. And it's got better for the reasons I've indicated, because people have learned and they've shared, and people like clinical senates have developed their methodologies, in fact, developed their methodologies extremely well. People take this stuff seriously, and NHS England latterly, as Johnny's outlined very well, has provided resources and learning. So the NHS has got much better at this, but it can still do better. We still see cases where shortcuts are taken, sometimes on the grounds of service or safety expediency, and where people who are blindingly obviously going to be upset or interested simply aren't communicated with or engaged. Johnny's mentioned duty to involve, and something we started saying a while ago, and it remains true. The NHS's legal duties to involve patients and the public are continuous. They're not something you reach for when you've got a difficult service change to think about. There's something that's continuous, and really a proposal for service change should build out of an NHS organisation's relationship with its users and the population and the public, and use the networks and resources that already exist to engage people in thinking about the issues and the problems and how to solve them. And one way of framing that is and this is a question the IRP asks when it's doing its review after the facts, is we look in all the documentation, we look for what the public, patients and staff are saying about this proposal. Not what people are reporting, they said, what they're actually saying. We're looking for evidence of them expressing what their issues are and what their assumptions about services that they use or are interested in are. And most importantly, possibly, we're looking for how they're shaping what is happening. Not just being told what is going to happen or being given options about what might happen, but are actually shaping what is happening. So I've given you an insight there into some of the sort of working questions that the IRP uses in its after the facts reviews. And then a couple of tips. Be open and authentic to avoid surprises. We see cases where actually the NHS and scrutiny and the public and local MPs work tremendously well together, and then for whatever reason a shortcut gets taken or a bit of a surprise comes out, and a lot of work over a lot of time gets tipped over. So openness and authentic behaviour throughout is really crucial. And strangely but regrettably, we still see the NHS taking what I would call a slightly alarmed or arm's length view of scrutiny and local authority scrutiny. Our advice is embrace scrutiny. Develop a relationship with your scrutiny officer and with the scrutiny counsellors, maintain that relationship on a business as usual basis, it'll make a discussion about tricky stuff so much easier. And that's what we look for. My final slide is to talk a little bit about what's changing. Johnny's touched on the 2022 Health and Care Act and the fact that it introduces new powers in this area for the Secretary of State. And Johnny correctly said, we're not sure exactly how those powers will manifest themselves in practice because regulations are still being discussed and guidance and implementation is still being worked on. But I want to just mention a few things that are in my mind about the next couple of years. Number one, thinking about the drivers for change. If you think about what is it at a strategic and tactical level which is really challenging the NHS in the way it delivers services, and how are those drivers changing? And these have been mentioned, but workforce, digital, and integrated care are things that could and should be potentially driving the service transformation and change agenda more than they have perhaps latterly. Second, and this is a post-pandemic observation, service change will come with a much sharper focus on health and healthcare inequality. The questions that will be asked about how your proposal addresses health and healthcare inequalities will be sharper and more challenging. And so the NHS has got to raise its game in terms of articulating the case for change through the lens of inequality. I've mentioned the 2022 Health and Care Act. It introduces new powers, the duty to notify, as Johnny correctly said. I think the Act says that the Secretary of State must be the NHS must notify the Secretary of State of those changes that he thinks he should be notified about, or some tautological statement like that. So it's to be defined, but hopefully, as one of the questions before indicated, there'll be a threshold that avoids useless bureaucracy. It is said that the power of referral will be removed from local authorities, but the political reality is that public interest expressed through elected representatives filters to ministers of the Secretary of State and leads to a response on occasions. So although scrutiny referral power may be going, other influences will get stronger. And the Secretary of State intervention and catalyst powers, the reality is that might lead to some of the typical process Johnny outlined being short-circuited or cut across. And that is yet to be thought about, but the IRP anticipates being in a position where we're advising the Secretary of State about how and whether to use these powers, and therefore we'll be engaging with local commissioners and others in that context in the future. So I'll finish by just saying that there's a hell of a lot of good practice on this stuff, and we're all concerned, aren't we, about the current state of the NHS, and we're all thinking, I wonder what the new act will do for us. The bottom line is there's quite a lot of unwarranted variation and better outcomes to be had for patients from good service change. And if nothing else, we should motivate ourselves by thinking about those and starting to look at them. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Richard. That was a super overview of what's happening and a few hints as to what may well be happening in the future. So that's great timing. We've got 5 minutes for questions. Who'd like to kick off? Dr. De Silva?
Hello. Hello. Thank you for really valuable presentations up to now, insightful and specific. I'm 39 years in the NHS now, and hopefully carrying on if my medical director is willing to accept my cheekness and things. We had a bet that today's meeting we were not going to touch on mental health and dementia. And we are halfway through at the moment, and no one has actually mentioned mental health. Because that's, the bottom line is this is going to be the hugely expanding area of work, both involving staff and technology and data and all that. And Rajesh is at every meeting he goes to, I'm sure he mentions, what about mental health? This quiet voice saying, what about mental health? So what are people's thoughts? Thank you.
Thank you. Richard, initial comments?
The history of NHS service change from an IRP perspective is that mental health change has featured, but it is in a very, very small minority of cases that we've looked at. That doesn't make them less valuable or less important. It's just a statement of fact. And it seems to me that there could be a couple of reasons for that. One is that actually, and this may sound strange, but actually engagement with service users in mental health and learning disability services has historically been better than with the general population in relation to, for example, acute hospital services. And the other is that that local authorities tend to be closer to these services, and therefore the balance of debate with local authority and scrutiny colleagues tends to be different. And I think the third reason, honestly, is that there is generally less interest in these issues from all perspectives, and therefore they tend not to gain quite the profile that they should.
Thank you.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up question, please?
Can I make a comment just to say that one of the recent reviews we've done has been on old age psychiatry and proposals for a reorganisation of old age psychiatry in part of Yorkshire. So certainly it has come up on our Senate's agenda. Sorry, you had another question?
Just a follow-up comment, really. I have made myself really unpopular by suggesting that actually mental health should be merged with social services, and we can save a huge amount of money, and we can pool our resources together. My current job is doing mental health act assessments, and I work closely with social services, and it has been a wonderful opportunity to work together, co-production and all that, which I don't get the same kind of feeling when interacting with NHS colleagues, because we tend to work in silos and we don't tend to step outside boundaries, which social workers often do. And so that would be something, but it is a radical transformation, which I don't know whether it will fly. I really don't, actually. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We've got time for one more question, I think, before we need to break. Anything else anyone wanted to raise? I'm just looking at the chat box. Martin, you've got a question.
I wondered what hi, Martin Vernon, cardiologist. I'm wondering what an increased focus on inequalities of access and inequalities of outcome would mean, because I think we're all wrestling with in reviews about the heroic efforts people are going to try and tackle inequalities when you've got a tsunami of perhaps austerity-induced inequality driven in healthcare coming at you. And where do you see in the reconfiguration landscape if you like, the divvy up of responsibilities for what you aspire to?
I think it's a really hard question. I I think there. I think it. So if I try and relate it to the duty to involve, when the duty to involve first came along, people sort of said, "Oh, I better involve people when I've got a difficult decision to make, or I've got to do something unpopular. I better get people round and talk to them about it." And I think we're sort of going to travel the same journey on inequalities and service change. I think the expectation that commissioners' understanding of inequality and let's concentrate on healthcare inequality and access to health services and achieving comparable outcomes. I think the expectation of commissioners' understanding of the current baseline and the assessment of positive impact on that baseline from service change proposals is going to rise enormously. And there's lots of other things we could say about inequality, but if I was going to tip off one place to start to focus more, that would be it.
Thank you. Okay, perhaps I could add a comment, Martin, that
Thank you.
without giving details, a recent review was looking at hub and spoke working within a service, and it was very impressive to see the work that had been done on how where you placed the spokes needed to be needed to consider inequalities, and the work they'd done to look at the measures of inequality in the different places where these spokes could go. So I think I back up exactly what you're saying, Richard. I think people are upping their game in terms of looking at measures to try and see how that affects, and therefore where you place services.
Yeah.
But I agree, it's easy to just play lip service. You've really got to dig down into some hard measures, and that's not always easy to do.
Okay, I mean, may I just add, Andrew, that I think the opportunity exists to recognise this need and actually to accelerate learning and development in the way you're describing by collaborating, looking across where people are doing this work and very quickly assimilating it. And if you haven't read the London Mayor's revisit of his inequality test, it's an interesting read. I mean, I'm not going to say any more, but it's an interesting read, if you know, in terms of a direction of travel and focus.
Yes, yeah. I think we probably should finish there, but John has made an interesting comment in his chat box that by making some people more equal, do you make others less equal?
Now there's the challenge.
Absolutely, a very good comment. I think at this point we'll break as planned. Thank you very much to our speakers. Thank you for the interactions, and we'll meet back at 3:05. Thank you very much.
Hello everybody, welcome back. My name's Chris Welsh and I will be introducing the next speakers. So without further ado, I hope you're all refreshed after that short break, and I'd like to welcome Gerard Hanratty, who is the head of health at Brown Jacobson. I've never met Gerard, but I've read his advice and reports on various occasions. And my understanding is he's the go-to person for healthcare related legal advice in reorganisation matters. So Gerard, without further ado, over to you. Welcome.
Thanks, Chris. I've got some slides. Is somebody going to put them up? Pam, are you going to put them up? No?
Sorry, no, I didn't realise you wanted me to do
Oh,
them.
sorry.
If you give me a second, I can do them for you. It won't be a minute.
Okay, thanks.
One second, sorry, Gerald.
No, it's all right. It's my fault. I've been running around doing lots of things. We have lots of reconfigurations going on at the minute, which is a good thing, but also a slightly interesting period. So as I'm going to go into, we have a little bit of legal uncertainty at the minute. I don't know whether Richard picked up on this. Richard's normally quite quick to tell me when I've got things wrong in his role as the Chief Exec of IRP. Not that I always happen to agree with him, I have to admit. I don't know if he's still on, but he'll probably say sometimes don't agree with the views from the IRP. But the changes we've got going on potentially come in from the Health and Care Act. The reason I say potentially is because we don't actually know if they're going to be implemented or not. But if they were implemented, it quite significantly changes the process. And the process is something that is pretty important, I think, to all of us, as I think, just from having a quick look at the chat you've been talking about today. So one of the things I just wanted to go through at the start is say, this is my kind of overview of the process. And the reason that the process from a legal perspective is so important is that when you get challenged, it's normally about the process. So the work you do within the clinical senate forms part of the process. The work you do separately, if you're supporting a system on its service reconfiguration outside of your role within the clinical senate, goes towards the process. Most of the judicial review challenges I've dealt with, or even the referrals by local authorities, go to process. Sometimes they're political referrals, but we'll look at those later on. But that's why the process, understanding and being clear on the process, is quite important. And we can't often go through this with clients. And to be honest, one of the first things is, I ask clients is, can you tell me why you're doing this, please? Because if you can't tell me how you're doing it, I'm not sure you're going to be able to explain to NHS England on an assurance process, but more importantly, how are you going to explain it to the public? Let alone how are you going to explain to the clinical senate how you've come up with these different options that you'd like their views on. So the client, my client, the NHS being able to explain what it is they're seeking to do is really important. And within that, and one of the things which the IRP have said time and time again is the NHS needs to be more positive when it is explaining the reasons for change. Quite often, the NHS will concentrate on trying to deal with those points they know the public aren't going to like. Well, whenever you bring in change, somebody's not going to like it, to be honest, but I've yet to see a change generally that doesn't have patient benefit within it. So being clear on the patient benefit is what's really needed early on when you're going through it. Engagement is important with the public. There's been a few cases where we've had engagement and they're not had a public consultation, which is not so great. Or we've had cases where there's not real engagement that has taken place. And again, the public don't like the feeling of being ambushed. They don't like suddenly getting a public consultation, and campaign groups especially don't like just getting a public consultation without having at least had the opportunity to input into what's happening. I know sometimes it can be quite difficult. The more people that you can actually get to talk to and to understand what's going on, the better. But I think a failure to do that can cause a lot of problems. Assurance and strategic sense checks as you go through are pretty important so that you're clear about what is actually possible. So we know, for example, money is tight. You have to understand what money is actually available on a capital spend basis for some of these changes. So understanding all of these things as you go through, we then come to the options appraisal. And sometimes it's quite interesting because quite often I will get people saying, well, there's only one thing that we can actually do here, which is fine. So you have a proposal that you need to take through. That doesn't mean to say the rest of the process goes out the window, though, because what we have to then show is that prior to coming to the realization there's only one realistic proposal that we can take forward to public consultation or to a wider engagement, that actually we have considered the options on a long list basis and we have discounted them for whatever basis. Normally there is threshold criteria that hasn't been reached, or on the option appraisal they don't actually fulfill the necessary issues that you need to deal with. So we still have to be quite clear over how those have been gone through. Clinical Senate input and review is still important when we go through anything, because we need to make sure that we have an independent verification on a clinical basis that these things work. But equally, it helps us to fulfill some of the rules that were, well, some of the views that were expressed by the government over the tests that should be in place. Those tests at the minute now really sit with NHS England. So the tests used to sit within the NHS Constitution. They've been taken out of the NHS Constitution, so now form part of the test process that NHS England put forward along with the bed test. That takes us through to the pre-consultation business case, where we should be able to fully explain why this change is needed, what it's going to cost, what the benefits are going to be. If we can't explain those things, then there is a problem and we need to deal with them, and we'll come on to some of the specific legal duties that arise from that. But I think one of the other things to note here, and I spend quite a lot of time saying to clients, is the public sector equality duty is undoubtedly very important, don't get me wrong. But the most important equality duty the NHS has is that which is very specific to them, which is clearly set out in the NHS Act, which is one of the underpinning pillars of the change to integrated care systems, and that is the duty to reduce inequalities of access and inequalities of outcomes. That is the big equality duty, and sometimes when you look at equality impact assessments, they do a lot on PSED, and they don't do, I think, enough on the outcomes and access bit. And I think that is something that we need to really be clear about, that this is one of the, this is the big equality duty, I think, that the NHS should be looking at. Once we've gone through that, we will look at how we fulfill the involvement duty that's there, which is quite often through public consultation. Sometimes we don't need public consultation. We're looking more now at when it is needed and not needed. We go into decision making, which we should be really clear about, but actually at times can be a little bit unclear due to who is the actual commissioner. Is it NHS England? Is it the ICBs? We have to be clear on any delegations. And then we have to be able to explain implementation as well. So those are all really important parts of the process that go all the way through. But really, it's the part up until public consultation that normally ends up being that which is the subject of criticism. So in terms of key legal duties, what do I look for when I'm going through these things? So firstly, we're looking to make sure that the NHS is effectively, efficiently and economically exercising its functions. So that kind of goes through everything and fits now into the triple aim duty, which is there. And I'm going to come on to the triple aim duty. I've highlighted two in red, and they're because they're quite new duties, but they're also important duties that people have to start remembering, need to be taken into account. So I have a big, well, I don't have a huge list. I have a list of the duties that I think are relevant. I'm quite happy to send that over if you want it. It has a lot more on than this, and it just goes through which section of the Act it is, be it NHS England or an ICB, and what generally what the duty is. And we give that to clients just as a kind of ready reckoner to say, this is what you need to think about. We do have a much, oh, sorry, that the slides aren't moving. Oh, that may be my fault because I thought I was moving them on. Could we just move, could we move the slides on through the first bit, which is current process, and onto slide 4, which is key legal duties? Has everybody got that up now?
Yeah, with Anna.
Good. Okay, thank you. So what I want to do, so I do have a much fuller list, and the list that we have actually goes through not only the statutory duties, sets out the common law position along Gunning and Moseley, but also deals with how you comply with procurement. I can't really do much on that at the minute because we're still waiting for the new law to come in and for the new regime to come in. They need to make sure as well that you talk to and consult your workforce. Workforce sometimes feel like they're the last piece of the jigsaw, and they shouldn't be, especially if you're moving services around so that clinicians and other healthcare professionals need to move their location. We need to have a proper discussion with them. up front, but there's a much wider one, but I'll send you the list that I've got for now. 13E and 14Z34, and the numbers are great. We now have, this is what comes of doing constant amendments to the NHS Act, that we have some interesting numbering going on. So continuous improvement in the quality of services provided to individuals for and in connection with the French diagnosis and treatment of illness. So when proposals are being put forward, they should be improving on those services which are currently there. Now, I know that can be a problem, having done quite a lot of work during COVID and done quite a lot of work on fragile services, that, you know, there's sometimes a bit of a tension that goes on into how you enable services to be as safe as possible, or how you say, actually, this is just not safe, we have to stop this. There is a basis on which you can may take the decision on an emergency basis to stop a service or to change how a service is done if there is an issue with regard to welfare and safety of patients or staff. And that means that the way the law actually works is the law says you don't have to consult with the local authority. We take a bit of leeway from that and say that actually means you don't have to comply with your public involvement duty as well. Nobody's actually challenged us on that. I'm sure if they did, we would succeed in persuading the court that must be the proper way to look at the law. But what it means is that you're not stuck there with a service that you know is unsafe. But once you know it's unsafe, you have to take action. You can't just let it limp along and then when it suits you, decide to take action. You have to take action at the time. But that is something that we should be looking at when services are going forward, that there is improvement there to meet the duties there. And then we come on to, as I said before, what I think is the most important duty on inequalities that the NHS has, which is 13G for NHS England, 14Z35 for ICB. So have regard, and notice that, have regard to. Now this applies to every single decision realistically NHS England or an ICB makes, that it has to have regard to the need to reduce inequalities between patients with respect to their ability to access health services, an important part of what you're doing in a reconfiguration, and reduce inequalities between patients with respect to the outcomes achieved for them by the provision of health services. So making sure that what you're doing actually fulfills those duties too. And we've had kind of one challenge to that so far, which didn't really get very far, but I'm sure at some point anybody who wants to challenge a change will look at that, will actually start to put together something that has a bit more meat to it. Coupled to that is also the fact, especially with the establishment of integrated care systems, that when you're looking at the way changes are being put together, there should be thought given to, can these services be provided in an integrated way that would improve their quality? And in so doing, also reduce inequalities of access and outcomes. And that applies to health services and then to health and social care services. And there is a lot of that we're looking at, especially out of hospital. The strange thing with it is that, well, not the strange thing, but the different thing is that in terms of social care services, this duty doesn't sit on local authorities, who generally have the responsibility to run those services. So there is a little bit that we just have to look at and see how all of that fits together. You'll then see the start of the next section in red, which is 13NA and 14Z43. As I said, it's great numbering. Even the judges, I have to admit, in times they almost seem to be shaking their head at me and at our barrister when we're trying to explain these things over the numbering. But this is the triple aim duty, and this is the duty that I don't think yet has really kind of been absorbed at times by the NHS. So it's another must-have regard to. Okay, so whenever you're making it, whenever NHS England or the ICB is making a decision, or in fact now NHS trusts and FT, so this is one of those duties that goes all the way across the NHS. It must have regard to all likely effects of the decision in relation to, firstly, the health and well-being of the people of England. So much wider than just your ICS. What's the wider impact? So is it a specialist service? does it have a wider impact? Is it going to have an impact on the ICBs next to you or the hospitals that are in close proximity? Is it about urgent care, emergency treatment, one of those things? We must look at the quality of services provided to individuals by the NHS and pursuance of arrangements made by it as part of the health service in England. So again, forcing the NHS to look more widely than just its own local geographical area. And then also consider the efficiency and sustainability in relation to the use of resources by relevant bodies for the purposes of health service. So this is quite a big, wide duty. You know, we spent a lot of time when the Equality Act came into being and we had the public sector equality duty in looking at how do we do an impact assessment, because we had to do one under that act. We don't have to do one anymore in terms of equality. But what you have to think about very much here is, how are you taking those factors into account? What is the kind of impact analysis you are doing to understand how this impacts across the wider geographical area you're in and on the patients that are in that wider area? And I think, you know, a little bit like NHS England on their assurance process kind of say, right, come on, where's this particular information on these particular duties, especially around inequalities and equalities, then I think this will become another one of those, because you must have regard to it. So if you don't do it, you face a technical challenge that you will lose. So whilst I'm pretty good at defending you on most judicial reviews, if you haven't done something and the law says you must have regard to it, and so you must do it, then I have a problem. And you might all remember the junior doctors case some years ago when Jeremy Hunt was Secretary of State for Health and not Chancellor of the Exchequer. And he faced an issue over whether or not he'd taken into account the public sector equality duty. And that was because he had no papers. So unlike the NHS, actually, the department hadn't done an analysis on paper. But he had to produce a statement that actually said, yes, he had taken it into account. It had been part of the thinking, and he got through on that. But that's an uncomfortable position to be in from a legal point of view, that I am having to get somebody, quite often probably the ICB chief exec or whoever the lead director is at NHS England, to sign a statement saying, well, I know we don't have any documented evidence of it, but yes, it was within our thinking when we made the decision. So actually thinking about how you're going to show that is going to be important as we go forward. Just then moving on to the next slide, and on to key legal duties too, then the other bit that's coming is climate change targets. And I've been in a few meetings where people have said, well, why does that really impact on us what it is? And it's because it relates to the access. So we've had quite a few issues. So especially all of the changes that were made in Dorset. Campaigners in Dorset actually challenged how long ambulances then had to go from one part of Dorset to the other part to get to A&E. And actually some of their climate change charities and campaigners became involved and were saying, well, you know, the impact that has, unless of course you have electric vehicles all over the place, which we don't yet. So all of this stuff is now coming in terms of, okay, what is the impact? And if you're doing a big building, if you're building a big new hospital, what's the impact of that? How does that help us meet the climate change targets? And again, it's a must-have regard. So we may have a perfectly good explanation and we may have taken it into account, but we have to show we've done that. And we do expect these are the kind of things that certainly on the climate change campaign groups, they may start looking at these if we start doing big changes to hospitals and building new hospitals, and may start saying, hold on, where's your evidence to show this? So all of this now comes into part of the process that we have to take into account. And so I think, you know, it means whenever anybody's looking at it, but even when you're looking at it within the concept of the clinical senate and you are looking at, does this fit clinically? There are all of those other points that will inevitably filter in when you're looking at, is this an option that's going to work for this particular system in order to deliver the patient benefits that they say? The public involvement in consultation duty is clearly still there, and one which we really need to be very clear about. I may have a bit of a campaign at times against local authorities who keep telling us we need to do 12 weeks on any form of public consultation. That originally came in several years ago when David Cameron was the Prime Minister. David Cameron produced some consultation, well, the Cabinet Office produced some consultation guidance, and they said 12 weeks is kind of the uppermost period, and that's really if you're planning to build a new nuclear power station. I don't think a hospital really compares to that kind of need for it. And I think, you know, if we're really going to work together collaboratively in an integrated fashion, then we need to start taking out some of the time that's been just built in and allowed to build into these processes. The process can be long enough. You know, the reality is that most consultations, the first 2 weeks, you get a whole load of people responding. The last 2 weeks, you have a whole load of people responding. Part of me thinks perhaps it should just be 4 weeks, because then we'd cut out the middle bit when lots of people don't bother to respond. But I think, you know, in many instances, somewhere between 6 to 8 weeks, we don't need 12 weeks, because unless there is some big event that is happening in the middle of it, like Christmas, then most people are going to do their responses. And really then it's about how we're engaging with them. So using digital technology, making sure we reach out on the internet, having some of the face-to-face meetings if they desire them, being clear on how we use the media as well, and social media, in order to make sure people understand what's going on. So what I hope is that as we go forward, we'll reduce that down. I think also there is something about thinking about what is the involvement we need. Public involvement in consultation doesn't mean to say you go to public consultation on anything. It means that you have a duty to involve the public. That may be you do public consultation. On the other end, it may be you do a really good engagement exercise, or you know the exact group you're talking to and you focus on them. So we have to think about that as we go forward. And then I've also have included Section 149 of the Equality Act and the Public Sector Equality Duty. I think one of the problems with that is sometimes a little bit of a tick box exercise, which you have to be careful about. But as I say, I think the bigger equality duty is already there, set out in the Act. In terms of case law, there is so much case law. I mean, any of you that have the joy of reading one of my advices will see that there is a fairly long section on case law, because we have so much of it at the minute, all of which kind of deals with some different bits. So it depends what the specific issue is. But the real one that most of us deal with in terms of consultation is gunning, and the fact that you have to make sure sufficient time is given to people. You have to make sure you give them good information so that they can understand what you're asking them and give informed responses. You have to make sure that you conscientiously consider all of their responses as well, and that you're actually taking all of that into account. So, you know, you're fully informed, and the decision maker is fully informed when they're actually going through that. So all of that is really important. But I think the kind of additional bit that has come across, so Gunning was a Court of Appeal case. Moseley was what is now the Supreme Court case, is that you should be consulting on realistic options. So consulting on something which can never be implemented, can never be achieved, is a pointless exercise. And we quite often have those discussions with campaign groups because they want to discuss whether or not you build a brand new hospital, because wouldn't that be wonderful? Well, I'm sure it would be, but it's never going to happen because there's no capital to do it. So actually, let's look at what the realistic options are that can be implemented, that can be actually provided. So there is a lot on that we need to make sure is done. And I think just being able then to show them what the long list is helpful, because then they can understand that as we go forward. And quite often, you know, so all my clients publish their long list, as really you should do when you go into a public consultation, because campaign groups are people who come along and say, oh, well, we think this, that, and the other. It's like, okay, we've already thought about it, and that's why this is not possible. It doesn't meet the threshold criteria. It's not possible to take forward. REASC. I put REASC in a Court of Appeal case, involved NHS England. It's one of my cases as well. What it did was it set out very clearly that all public authorities have a common law duty of fairness. They must use that in decision making. That means taking into account all of the relevant information and enabling people who may be affected adversely by the decision to give their viewpoints, preferably before the decision is made, but if not, after the decision is made, with it being clear that decision could potentially be changed. So that's a really clear exposition by the Court of Appeal on that. We also then have a whole load of other cases. As I've said, there's always a long list that we can use, but the Royal Brompton case was interesting a number of years ago because it made clear that up to the point a final decision is made, any process can self-correct itself. And what people had to be careful about was not to try and involve the court too early. So that's always an important thing. So whenever I go back and do a check on the PCBC for clients, I am then looking to see, is there something which needs to be corrected here in order to avoid a potential challenge? Because if there is, we can do it there and then, and we can save time and money at a later date, even if it takes a little bit of time to correct things. Cherwell was kind of an interesting point on predeterminations. So two processes, process one, looking at some specific changes that wanted to be made in Oxfordshire, process two, to then look at later changes. The argument being from the campaign group, there's no point to process two because all of the relevant decisions are made in process one. So process two to make decisions is a sham. The decisions are already made and you're just trying to do it without a consultation. Court didn't agree. Court said we don't think that's the case, but did actually not give a very helpful view in that the court said we'll know this when we see it in predetermination. Not the best test in the world, but is there. And Corby CCG, as you may remember, they went through a whole process over their urgent care centre. They engaged with the public. They spoke to them a lot about changes that were going to be made, and said, yes, we're going out to public consultation, then decided the changes weren't actually as extensive as they thought, so they wouldn't do public consultation. And lo and behold, they get a challenge that there's a legitimate expectation, and the court says, well, there clearly was because you'd said it. And so they had to go to public consultation and they lost that particular JR. So you have to be careful about what you say. If you're going to say you're going to do public consultation and you make a clear and equivocal promise to do it, you pretty much have to do it. Just quickly, I know I'm probably running out of time, I always run out of time. So what do we get for challenges? So we get referral by local authority, 3 bases, not satisfied with the consultation. No, that's a consultation with them. We've had this argument, the IRP agreed with us actually on it, that this referral by the local authority is about the consultation with them, not the public consultation if you are having one. Not satisfied with reasons for any emergency decision, go back to an earlier point I made as to the risk to safety or welfare of patients or staff. So if you do something, but actually there's no immediate risk, they can say, okay, we're going to refer you to the Secretary of State. Or the catch-all, which they quite often use, proposal not in the interest. So note, not doesn't have best in there, just not in the interest of the health service in its area. So that's what we call the political referral, because it's a fairly low threshold. Judicial review, we have ultra vires, which is that the relevant body didn't have the power to make the decision. That should never really happen. We're very clear over checking who is the responsible decision maker, normally between the ICB and NHS England in most instances. Procedural impropriety is normally the one that we get challenges on. So that's where there is a failure to follow the process. It may be a failure to properly deal with all of your duties, such as a failure to properly have due regard to inequalities or due regard to the wider effect or impact of a decision. And irrational, we've never ever lost a case on an irrational decision. I can't even remember the NHS losing one, because the whole assurance process should ensure that never happens. I've just put in there at the bottom some of the things the IRP have said. I'm sure Richard took them through you earlier today. Other things that really should be thought about when you're doing something. So being clear on your vision, having a credible case for change, articulating benefits for patients, having clarity on the comprehensive implementation plans as we go through, and having a transparent process. Very quickly, the Health and Care Act introduced, so this was something Matt Hancock introduced. I can't remember, if you remember, there was an issue in Lancashire over one of the EDs, and Matt Hancock became involved, and before the select committee, he indicated to Jeremy Hunt that he had stepped in and made a decision. The reality is, at that point in time, the Secretary of State had no power to do that. The Secretary of State could indicate something to NHS England, who were then entitled to talk to the CCG as they then were, and may decide to intervene. NHS England had that power, but the Secretary of State didn't. So what we then found written into the Health and Care Act was this, that the Secretary of State basically could step into any service reconfiguration, all of which had to be notified to him, with the definition of notifiable to be provided by the Secretary of State. But once he did that, and if that was called in, that service reconfiguration, then the Secretary of State had all the powers to make decisions that an ICB had. We were all there going, okay, that's a pretty major change to the process we currently have. When is this going to come into being? We then had a change in the Secretary of State as we were going through. So we had Sajid Javid, who, from what I could tell, didn't really seem to be that interested in this particular part of the Act. We then had Therese Coffey. We now have Steve Barclay. Well, second time around for Steve Barclay. To be honest, at this point in time, and I don't know whether Richard mentioned this earlier, whether he had any greater knowledge, we haven't seen that there is any great wish to enact this. So it's there. It's sitting in the Act. What they haven't done, though, is they haven't enacted it, is that they haven't actually brought it in so that it has power. So at the minute, we're still under the system we've been talking about, where local authorities do the overview. We don't have this process. If we do have this process, it's going to make, I think, service reconfiguration more political, because you will have MPs, as we do quite regularly, complaining to the Secretary of State about things if they get complaints from their constituents. And we'd have to see how it all panned out, because it would inevitably mean that the role for the local authorities in terms of referral to the Secretary of State effectively disappears, because the Secretary of State is going to start making that decision. So we're still waiting to see what happens to that, but that is quite a big potential change that hovers on the horizon at the minute. So just now in the future, where are we? So we have quite a good current established process. I think there are some changes that need to come through, like the changes to the provider selection regime and procurement. We need to be really clear on you know, the way that an integrated care system operates together through the collaborative approach. And I think we need to see what's going to happen with these new Secretary of State powers, because they are quite key to how the process operates overall. There is a focus on equalities and inequalities, and better clinical care for all. I think that comes through quite clearly from the Health and Care Act. You do have to look more at the wider effect of service reconfiguration, and I think that is something that we have to get to grips with. I don't think we yet really have a good grip on it, and we have to make sure that becomes part of the process in a very clear way. And also within that, that should encourage greater system collaboration as we move along. The reality is, and I think NHS England know this, and I quite often help them with their guidance documents, all of the guidance documents do need to be updated a bit. But the reality is, in some instances, we're still waiting for some information. So, you know, it'd be great to be clear on, this is the new procurement regime. It's all in place. We all understand that perfectly well. It would be really helpful to know, what is the Secretary of State's position? Does the current Secretary of State actually want to enact that section in the schedule, or is he not bothered, leaving it where it is? Don't worry about it for now, because that has an impact. That also makes it key, and also makes it clear what the roles of the various bodies are. Just being clear on, NHS England effectively are doing more regulation now, especially with the delegation of a lot of their commissioning functions. The decisions we expect actually on the changes, by and large, will therefore pass over to ICBs. ICBs clearly have the main role at the minute in decision making. I know I keep getting asked by NHS providers, shouldn't it be us? Quite often no, because you have a vested interest within what's happening. You're definitely part of the process. You're definitely important to understanding the art of the possible, the service change, but the actual decision is also in effect a contractual change between you and the commissioner. So we have to be clear on that. We have to be clear on who's making those decisions. The Treasury and the capital need, we need to be clear about, which includes the new hospitals programme and what's happening with that. The potential change with local authorities and what their role is in terms of referrals is going to be important. And that comes down to then, okay, what's the role of the HOSC now? Do you still have to go in front of the scrutiny committee and make them aware of what's going on, which I would expect would be the case, but do they no longer have the ability to refer? And how does this all work within the planning cycle for the integrated care partnerships as well, and what they're saying the strategic needs are? Clinical senates, I'm afraid across all of that, both within your normal work within the NHS and supporting you on service reconfig, but within your work is in the clinical senates as well. You do need to understand all of this, because the kind of way that you will be looking at things and the reasons why things may change may start to look a little bit different, and some of the information you get may start to look a little bit different, I would hope, especially over what's the wider impact. If we're going to do this change clinically, it looks okay if I'm just looking at this particular geography, but what about more widely? What impact is that going to have? The IRP, so far as we understand it, are going to stay. There was a question mark over that, but I understand they're being retained. And we're waiting to see what the DHSC role is, because we need to see what the Secretary of State wants to do. I'm sorry, I think I've gone a bit over, but that was all I had to say. I don't know if there's any questions or whether people just want to send me questions later on. I'm very happy to answer them.
Thank you, Jared. I don't think we've got time for questions, but we're very happy for questions to be put into the chat, and we can get to them in due course. So I'd like to move on and introduce Rachel Jones. And Rachel is the Director of Strategy and Planning and Partnerships at Maidstone and Tunbridge Wells Trust. And Rachel has the experience of being involved with 2 judicial reviews. So Rachel, thank you, and over to you. And first of all, do you wish us to drive your slides, or are you driving them yourself?
No, it would be lovely if you could do that. That would be great. Thank you very much.
Okay, over to you.
Thank you. So I'll just set with a little bit of context, because I'm now at Maidstone and Tunbridge Wells Trust, but when I was undertaking the role that I'm talking to you about today, it was only a few months ago, and it was actually a strategy role across Kent and Medway, so leading on the really big reconfiguration programmes that we've got going in Kent and Medway. And the one that I particularly want to focus on with you, because not only did we go to judicial review, but we also went to the High Court, which was an experience, was the acute stroke reconfiguration. And if you could go to the first slide, please, that would be lovely.
I think that's the second slide that
Sorry,
we need
yes,
to go to.
Yeah, please.
The slide should be on, is it not on?
No,
the slides
it's not.
are on, but if you could move to slide number 2.
Oh, sorry.
Perfect. Thank you. That's perfect. So I just want to sort of set the scene before I explain what happened, and particularly with the role of the clinical senate, it was invaluable. But if Kent and Medway is and was and is even one of the only parts of the country that doesn't have any hyperacute stroke units, and the stroke performance had been really poor. I mean, some of the worst in the country, and it had been for many years, to be honest. It wasn't something new by a long stretch, and we were really struggling, despite improvement programmes, really struggling to improve that. And just to give you a flavour of it, we've got 7 relatively small to medium-sized district general hospitals in the patch. None of them we're not a tertiary centre in any of them, or big specialist units. It's a very rural patch, Kent and Medway. If you've ever been, I'm actually originally from Stoke-on-Trent in the north, but Kent and Medway is very rural, so lots of small district general hospitals with nothing major in its footprint. And 6 of the 7 of them were actually providing some form of acute stroke care, and that really was all they were doing. You know, they were really doing their best with a very difficult situation, and we're serving a population of about 1.8 million people, just to sort of set the scene on the size of it, but very geographically spread out. And the aim of the review was really actually quite straightforward, was to implement a viable number of hyperacute and acute stroke units to improve outcomes, reduce death and disability. And I'll talk you through the story, but eventually where we got to was a strap line, which took a long time to agree because of the connotations of it. There was lots of worry, but actually we proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that by doing this, we would save a life a fortnight. And that did not include any improvements in disability or morbidity. It was purely, that was a life saved. And that was done in conjunction with one of the universities that had also supported the Manchester and London reconfigurations, which had taken place so many years before, that we'd actually got really good outcome and improvement data from them, and we could draw analogies across, and we were supported to do that. I'll try and sort of distill down what we did, because a lot of it goes back to what Gerard was just talking about, and I was smiling to myself, for those of you that could see me, with some of the advice he was giving, and that was my real life experience. I can completely concur. The only thing that's relatively new that we didn't have to sort of grapple with was the green agenda, but certainly you know, campaign groups and transport. And for those of you who don't know, and I'm sure it's true in some of your areas, but travel times and access between sites is just such a massive political issue and campaign issue and council issue in Kent and Medway. To give you an example, we've got East Kent Hospitals Trust with 3 of the district general hospitals, but they are more than 50 miles apart, and sometimes it can take an hour to get from one to the other, depending on the traffic, because we do not have a very good road infrastructure. We've got 2 motorways that literally run horizontally across the county, and they're great, but if you try and travel from the north to the south of Kent, the roads are very poor. They're sort of A roads, and lots of stops and problems. So there's travel and transport here, and particularly in time sensitive conditions it's a really big issue. And I've put that there, that the single biggest issue raised through the whole piece was, and we did a formal public consultation, was travel. And there was a real fixation on that patients were going to be travelling further, because as you can imagine, with 6 out of 7 of our units providing services, that we were always going to increase travel times no matter what we did, and we were always going to increase travel times depending on the number of units. And the issue for me was that while the travel times were relatively short, people would then wait 6, 7, 8 hours in A&E and actually not get put on a stroke pathway, not 24/7 stroke cover. In fact, in some hospitals, it was a few hours a day if you were lucky, any sort of proper stroke cover. So we were getting really poor outcomes, even though the journeys to hospital actually were relatively short. So we worked on the basis of geography. Actually, 2 sites from a volume point of view would have been okay. But actually, the problem with 2 sites in Kent and Medway is that it would not have given reasonably enough access in terms of travel times for people. And so we moved to a 3-site model, and all of this work was tested with the South East Coast Clinical Senate at every stage. And I'll come on to the number of times they saw the case and some of the advice they gave in a little while. But we moved into a position where we got a decision. We went to public consultation with 5 options on the table, and we talked to the public about all 5 options, but ultimately obviously have to come down to a view to choose one. And I'm not going to go through that whole process with you because we probably haven't got time, but we eventually came down to an option which fundamentally we'd put a joint HOSC together of 4 councils, so not just the 2 in Kent and Medway, the Kent County Council and Medway Council, but also East Sussex and Bromley, and they're right on our borders, and patients were going across the borders for stroke care in both directions at the time. And the joint HOSC supported everything that we did, having been very challenging as we went through, which is entirely right, that's their job. But right at the end, I learned a very important lesson, which I think is useful for you all to know, which is that joint HOSCs actually do not have the power to refer or not refer to the Secretary of State. The individual councils, even with the establishment of a joint Health Overview and Scrutiny Committee, retain that power. And actually Medway Council exercised their right because simply the chosen configuration did not have a hyperacute stroke unit in Medway, and so they supported the programme all of the way through until it was clear that the final choice wouldn't be a HASU in Medway. So we got referred to the Secretary of State by Medway Council, and we got referred to the High Court by 2 campaign groups that sought legal aid. And again, in my experience now, and I've done this twice, legal aid is almost always granted in these circumstances, but it is the only way by which those campaigns actually are able to take something to the High Court, because it's an incredibly expensive process. So we went to the High Court too. Unfortunately, we had all the changes that Gerard talked about with the changes in Secretary of State. Matt Hancock took over 18 months to even come to review, which is unprecedented. I mean, we were through, some of this was through COVID, but it was completely unprecedented, the delay. And then just as we thought we'd got a decision, he stepped down and we had to start the whole process again with Sajid Javid. And luckily that only took another 6 or 7 months, but in total we were delayed for 2 years. And of course, then the campaign group said, oh, well, things are different now because 2 years and COVID's happened and you need to start again, which of course we didn't. But it is very interesting that the amount of time delay can cause very, very significant rework. Could you move to the next slide, please? So I just want to give you a picture of Kent and Medway for those of you who don't know it. But the 3 big balloons in the middle going across the county horizontally would be the new sited HASUs, and the other H's are the other district general hospitals. So you just get a sense of rurality and how far apart things are in terms of Kent and Medway. Next slide, please. So I won't talk to all of this, but I just wanted to share the timelines with you, because when we talk about things changing, you can see that really, I would say we properly started in January 18. So we did lots of pre-work, lots of recognising the problem in 2015. I saw some of the questions to Gerard's comments about surely you get penalised for doing nothing. But I can't tell you the amount of time and obstacles and hurdles that something on this scale actually takes to do. And all the while, you know, we've got poor services and patient care isn't what it should be and outcomes are not what they should be. And so it is really important that sitting underneath this, there's a local programme of improvement to do the best you can do with what you've got in the meantime, because actually these things take years to do. So we started a public consultation in early 2018. And we then went through a process of shortlisting to a final option. And in January 19, we had the decision-making business case finalised. And I'll never forget the night on the 14th of February, Valentine's Day, 2019, the joint committee of CCGs, as was 10 of us, 10 CCGs, actually made the decision to support the business case. But by within weeks, the application for the judicial review had gone in, and we had done our level best, I think, to work with Medway Council. What could we have done to stop that? I've reflected very long and very hard on that question. And I think that as we were moving from the short list of options that were 5 to the preferred option, some information changed quite substantially and significantly that impacted Medway. And it wasn't actually about Medway. So when you're doing multi-site options, the lesson here is lots of external factors can absolutely implement what you're doing. And I want to give you the example. So Bromley, which is on our borders, and a good percentage of Kent patients would need to, if Dartford had not been a hyperacute stroke unit right on our border, then another 200 stroke patients a year would have flowed to Bromley. And we got to a place where they were in a different ICS, in a different footprint, and part of NHS London at the time. And they refused. They were unable in any situation, even with investment, to take an additional 200 patients. And we explored that really carefully with the Senates as well as with the regulators. But actually what that meant was that Dartford therefore became a fixed point. We had to have a hyperacute stroke unit in Dartford because there was no way of those patients otherwise being managed. And that negatively impacted Medway, which was not very far away in terms of travel times and distance. It really negatively impacted the Medway case. And then finally, the final thing that changed was one of the costs of one of the options, actually down in Tunbridge Wells. took it out, there was a complete misunderstanding of the cost, and when it was reworked, actually the cost went over the total envelope for the reconfiguration. So it made the proposition of selecting Tunbridge Wells very unlikely in a configuration of 3. And so both those things directly impacted on the likelihood that Medway would be one of the HASUs. And my reflection from that learning is that maybe we should have had that conversation much more transparently with Medway. They were involved in all of the workshops and all of the decisions, but actually we didn't go and meet them specifically to talk them through those changes. So that's a lesson learned. So I think you've heard from, did Richard Jeevens speak earlier on? He was on the agenda. So Richard and I were on speed dial at one point because the IPR obviously seek all of the information, and that's what happened. So it went to the IPR in October 19. And while the two processes are not linked technically, actually what I learned is it's really unlikely that the Secretary of State will report if there's an open legal case. They usually want to wait and see what happens in the legal case, and that's what happened in this case. But that was actually heard relatively quickly. So in December 19, so 7 or 8 months after the referral was made, we actually were in the High Court. And the following February, so about 8 weeks later, we got the ruling handed down, and it was one of the most in favour of the NHS rulings there's ever been. They didn't find us at fault on any of the counts, of which there were 8, and so that was really it was unprecedented, really. And so then they made a move to appeal, which was actually rejected, but all of that took another 7 months to go through the process of them wanting an appeal and rejecting. But we then waited another 15 months for the Secretary of State to make a decision, having appeal been rejected in in August 2020. It was actually November 2021 before the Secretary of State gave a view, which, would you believe, after all of that, supported the proposals wholeheartedly. So it was a long journey. But of course, by then, all of our estates options about how we were going to deliver hyperacute stroke units in Kent and Medway had completely changed. We were in through COVID, the estate had been used for other purposes, the costs were all different, and so we had to start, essentially, we've been doing some work ongoing, but with delays of that significance, obviously we sort of had to stop slightly because it was becoming ridiculous, but we had to therefore restart and outline and full business cases again. So it's just the rework involved, and obviously clinically things have moved on slightly, new clinical guidelines and things have happened during that period. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to talk to you a little bit and focus on the Clinical Senate's role, and just, again, I've got the Clinical Senate manager and clinical director on speed dial through this whole process because we were also working on a big case in terms of transforming the East Kent services. So for both of these cases, they were absolutely critical. But I put the timeline on before so you can see now where the Clinical Senate were involved, and they undertook 3 very important reviews for us. So one was right at the very beginning when we were looking at the case for change and actually trying to work out, was it strong enough to justify going on to this sort of approach? And they raised 10 significant issues which fundamentally helped shape the case for change, and we had to respond to. And I'm happy to share with you afterwards the decision-making business case, because there's this whole section on the feedback that the Senate gave us and our response to each of those points, which you may or may not find helpful. They reviewed again in January 18 the care models and options appraisal. And this was a really very substantial document at this point. And there were 27 significant issues raised, which all needed addressing before we wrote the full business case. And then finally, we were at here's the preferred option, and this is how we're going to do it. This is how we're going to do it phase. And they raised a very similar number of issues. 29 issues were raised and again responded to. And I think it was really important that they were, because for NHSE, actually, the Clinical Senate provided the clinical oversight and challenge to the case. And it was really very powerful when it came to NHS England and the national review of the approval of the case. It was a really important part of the clinical oversight. So can we go to the last, next slide, please? Thank you. So I just want to focus now, despite the Clinical Senate support and all of the clinical work, we had external consultants from other areas supporting us. We made sure that we were really challenging ourselves, and lots of external input from universities, but also from places outside of Kent and Medway. But the most difficult thing, I think, for those of us involved, and the clinicians were outstanding. You know, the medical director from Medway was completely supportive, even though his trusts were losing hyperacute stroke services. He felt it was such a better option for our patients. But actually, what was really important, and this is where the saving a life a fortnight came from, the public really were very negative about the case for change, despite the overwhelming, massively overwhelming clinical evidence. It was unbelievable. And actually, we had a really difficult time being prepared to be very honest about just how poor some of the services were. And I can't tell you the battle I had. There was a real reluctance to do that, because people were so worried about losing faith in current services and how that works while all these services have to carry on. But genuinely, my hand on my heart, we really only changed the perception and the need to do this when we said we'd save a life a fortnight. Everything changed at that point. It really crystallised just how poor the services were, despite lots of dashboards of red and amber everywhere, you know, D's and E's instead of A's and B's everywhere for years. And actually, because you've got to travel further, it was really poorly received by the public. And I think the thing I learned was that they just think we're always going to do the absolute best and be top in class in everything. That's the expectation people have, and that's not an unreasonable one. But often in these big cases where we need to make change, that just isn't true, and we weren't doing right. So that was a big lesson. I've already said to you that joint health overview scrutiny committees, or whatever the sort of equivalent in your part of the world is, can only recommend. So my honest advice is keep really close to the relevant local authorities and reduce the risk of a referral to the Secretary of State. The High Court was actually attested the process and the governance and the minute taking and the how did we make decisions. And Gerard said before, there was uncomfortable moments when you couldn't evidence a conversation. It was more than uncomfortable in the High Court. I have to say it was the most unpleasant experience I think I've had. Amazing experience. I wouldn't have changed it for the world, but very unpleasant, I have to say. And I was really proud actually that we did get our documentation right, and everything was documented, and decisions recorded, and who was in the room, because we got challenged a lot on who was in the room, for example, and the clinical senate and the tests and their feedback was all part of that. You won't be surprised I've put work closely. That's probably the understatement of the century. As I said, we were on speed dial at many points in the process. Everything, the approval takes months to conclude, and you must factor that in. I mean, at least 6 months every time you complete a big business case to go through the national process. And just my final reflection really is everything took so long, and I appreciate it was unprecedented with the delays to the Secretary of State, but I'm involved in several of the big schemes, and you're talking 2 to 3 years, even if one goes well. And then things really start to change and materially impact the case. So the amount of rework is phenomenal. And actually, clinically, from a Senate point of view, you know, new guidance comes out, things change, NICE changes, GIRF changes, you know, all those things. You just have to keep refreshing the document and keep looking at it with a new pair of eyes. So that sort of, I don't want to, I'm conscious, we might be back on track. I'm conscious of your time because you've had a long afternoon. I'm just going to look, there's a question actually in the chat. Senate advisory team published first legal challenge. No, that wasn't our experience. That it actually wasn't the Senate's advice that was legally challenged. It was how we took the advice and then the outcome we came to. And as I said, straightforwardly, Medway Council just was so unhappy that ASU wasn't going to be in Medway, and that's what it really boiled down to. And that was really disheartening, I've got to say. But just to tell you a really positive thing, I want to just give you some positive. So we've put the first FASU into Maidstone Hospital, which is where I'm sitting today. We've done it finally. And actually during COVID, we had to consolidate services from 6 to 3. We had no option because the services fell apart during COVID, not least because we'd already made the decision we were going to go to 3, and then people started to leave and then COVID hit. But I've got to tell you that in our SNAP rating, which for those of you who don't know is a national measure of stroke performance, We've gone from D's and E's to A's just by consolidating. We've done an amazing job, and you know what? I feel completely privileged and honoured to have been part of it. And now we go the final step and we put proper hyperacute stroke units in. So it was a journey. You're right. Somebody's put what a journey. Yeah, it was one. And I think the only time I got to answer John's question, the only time I got really fed up and had to go home and have wine was after the High Court case, because that was impactful. It felt like I was on trial personally, and that didn't feel very nice. And you worried you'd done something wrong. You know, you feel a great sense of responsibility when you sat there. But I think the final bit was actually right at the very end when I thought we'd done it. And then NH England came back and said, you've got to rewrite all these business cases because they're too old now. At that point, I actually could have cried. I didn't cry. We did do them and we have got it over the line. But that was probably the lowest moment, I guess. So I'm just kind of have a look. Who's been to have a political profile? Yeah, so I'm more than happy. So just to say at the end, I'm really very happy for any of you to contact me individually, particularly around how we managed the politics and MPs and the HOS, because there's some real lessons learned for me, and I probably haven't got time to go into them all here. But if any of you do have anything that I can help with, really please, genuine offer. At least going through the experience means I can help somebody else, then it makes it doubly worthwhile, because it's not often that you go through these, you know, there aren't that many of us that have gone through these sorts of big challenges. Let me yeah, Dennis, I really do try and offer that help, because it is sometimes it's just knowing where the black holes are going to come, and then you avoid stepping into them in the first place, to be honest. And some of that I didn't have and had to learn the hard way. But yeah, thank you. I can see a hand up. I'm sorry, I can't see your name, but there's a lady with a hand up.
Rachel, can I just say thank you so much for your presentation. And we've just got to admire your determination in carrying out this reconfiguration marathon, I think is the only way to describe it. Andrew, you've got your hand up.
Thank you. Yes, well, I empathise totally, Rachel, having been through this some years ago, and I think you've done amazingly. My comment that was in response to the question about senates, actually, when we got taken to judicial review, there were issues against the Senate which were around the process we'd followed. And the particular point was around why we hadn't considered certain interrelationships. And the point was that they were specifically not included in our terms of reference. And the judge was perfectly happy with that. And that taught me the lesson that be very careful when you take on a review to know what the terms of reference are, and perhaps even more importantly, to know what's not included.
Absolutely, and I think that's a really amazing example of my point about documentation. You've got to be as clear as you can be. Your decision making's got to be clear, and what you are commenting and deciding on has got to be clear. And actually, we got exactly that. You know, that's exactly what the High Court said to us. You document. The people don't like it, but actually the documentation's clear, and you followed a really strong process. So I completely agree with you. It is all about those audit trails, and just a lesson from me is keep the audit trails from the beginning, because trying to go back and re-piece together something that's happened in the past is actually really difficult, particularly when some of the phone calls are verbal, you know, some number of calls with the Senate, but we'd always put things in writing to each other once we'd spoken on the phone, for example. So, you know, it's a really important part of the process, I would suggest, from a Senate and from whoever's leading the reconfiguration. You know, you need to have your communication in order so that you're not misrepresented. But without the Senate, we just wouldn't have had a chance. And it was really important part of the work. As I said, it was all of the clinical oversight was really done by them, to be honest.
Rachel, Jared, thank you very much for a sparkling session, which one or two of us thought might be rather dry and legal, but actually it's kept us all wide awake. So thank you very much indeed. And I'll hand back now to Vernon.
Thanks, Andrew and Chris. So yeah, it just falls on me now to try and wrap this up in the last 20 minutes or so. So first of all, thank you to all of our speakers. Just to try and summarize a few key points, I think. Incredible richness coming out of each of these talks and much to digest and much to take away. Thank you to everybody for comments in the chat, which again we will be capturing as we go along, and some really interesting conversations going on in the background. So thank you first of all to Yvette for opening us up and giving the context to the day. Challenging, difficult times in the health service, wasn't it ever thus? I think just to balance that off at the end, Rachel's account there really does pay testament to the resilience and enthusiasm of colleagues in driving service changes through and staying with it right to the very end. So really quite an amazing human story of endeavour and achievement, actually. Many thanks to Richard and Johnny for setting out, first of all, Johnny with the process that we're under, and also introducing the new, as yet to be, I think, fully understood powers and duties introduced by the Health and Care Act, and to Richard for emphasising things that particularly find their way to the IRP. And I think we've heard this message repeatedly, but getting the rationale right, understanding the feasibility and the money, considering the workforce feasibility, transport issues came out many times this afternoon, and overwhelmingly the need to engage from the outset and continuously. And then Gerard's presentation was incredibly helpful. There's an awful lot in there to digest, and I think we'll be poring over the slides from that for some time to come. But again, the message that stood out from there for me was that of process, and I think again emphasised by what Rachel's just alluded to at the end, along with Andrew's comments, that getting the process right for all of us is incredibly important. As far as the Senate's role concerned, I've heard really some very encouraging comments about the role of the Senate. I think there was one of the comments in the chat was, could the Senate's advice be criticised? Well, at the end of the day, as far as I see it, and as a chair of the North West Senate, the Senate's there to provide advice. Of course, that advice can always be ignored, but it's advice from people who are themselves overwhelmingly able to demonstrate expertise in what they're talking about, and collectively that is incredibly powerful. And I think we've just heard at the end there that the role of the Senate in any challenge process for service change is crucial. So really helpful to hear all of that, and as I say, I think a lot to think about, particularly as a Senate chair. I will be taking an enormous amount away from this afternoon. What I'd like to do is now two things. One is to open it up for further comments, observations, any questions to any of our speakers who remain with us. And there is, to round us off, a further Menti exercise, which hopefully will have a QR code, so scan it into your mobile device and answer the 3 questions. This is helpful to us to understand the value of this afternoon to you, and thank you to everybody for staying with it. I think we topped out at about 63 people, so but please do provide your feedback from today. I'm going to go to questions from the floor now. So Dr. De Silva, hand up again.
Hello, I suppose this is a question for you, really. Would it be a thought to have a further sessions on the implications of net zero 2030? Because I get the I mean, like I said, I've been 39 years. I've seen lots of things come and go. I get a feel of where the money is, basically. And there's lots and lots of money to do with transforming on the basis of net zero. And I did wonder whether the Senate might want to have a meeting with the relevant experts about how to get the best out of the agenda for net zero and what implications it has in terms of patient care. Wondering, I don't want to have another meeting, but it sounds like it's highly relevant. And the Care Act, the Health and Care Act, that hasn't got a huge amount of money, to be honest. There's lots of money in net zero, believe me. And so wondered whether it might be a thought to have another meeting. Sorry, thank you.
So happy to take the reflections of my co-chairs, but I mean, my own response to that is it's clearly of huge importance. I think increasingly we are starting to see due scrutiny given to the obligations to consider net zero and going forwards. And I think this will assume greater importance. So yes, a really helpful suggestion. And certainly something that as Senates we need to equip ourselves with the right knowledge and understanding. This is not an easy topic to get your hands around, but really helpful suggestion. I don't know whether Andrew or Chris want to comment on that as chairs of the other two Senates.
Just quickly, I think the key thing to remember is that Senates are essentially reactive bodies, so that I don't think it's our place necessarily to initiate that. But as with the question of equalities, we need to be much better at asking the questions when we're doing the review. Has this been considered? What work have you done? And as I alluded to earlier, I was very impressed in a recent review with the work that had been done on access inequality, and one would hope we'd see the same about net zero.
Yeah, thanks, Sandra. I'll go to Willie next.
Thanks, Vernon. Thanks, Rachel. That was an incredible journey. Really fascinating to listen to. And when I was listening to it, you know, there were so many challenges that you faced with and that you would have had to work through. But ultimately, and I'm guessing what got the case was patient safety and the fact that you had a strong clinical case for change. I know you had challenges with finance and transport and green and access, etc. So I guess that's where we come into it, isn't it? Because it's clinicians helping to support the clinical case and making that clinical case as robust as possible. So I think that I just made the observation that patient safety again seems to trump everything. But having said that, you also mentioned that despite the poor services in one of the hospitals, patients still wanted the service to be preserved there. And I've had experience with that in our area where we were wanting to consolidate services onto a hot site. And in fact, it was a few years ago, the local MP was one of the drivers for preserving the service, even though understanding that the service was of a lower quality and would have rather his constituents have a hospital on their doorstep, which he knew wasn't providing the same level of service. It is a challenge to try and overcome, even though the clinical case was overwhelming.
No, absolutely. And to be honest with you, it was a shock for me because the clinical, I mean, I wouldn't have wanted to be trying to do something that hadn't got much of an evidence base, you know, something innovative, something new. I don't know how we would ever go about it in the English NHS doing that, because even with the overwhelming evidence for stroke, you know, both nationally and internationally, actually, we had lots of people say to us, I don't care, I just want to go to my local hospital. We had MPs say the same. That it was shocking, I have to say. To be honest, when we transformed into this is going to save a life a fortnight, that was much more difficult then. You know, people were actually dying that didn't need to die. We didn't quite put it like that, but the save a life a fortnight became the strapline. And it did change things, but it took me probably 3 years of the 5 to get people comfortable that we were going to have to do something like that and say it that way, because people just weren't accepting how poor, how, you know, the D's and E's and the reds were meaning nothing to people. It's really hard for anybody to campaign against saving a life. That we found that actually worked to a real advantage, but it was difficult to get agreement to do it. So yeah, you're absolutely right. The one thing I will say about clinically led, not only the Senate were amazing, but we got medical staff and nursing staff and therapy staff from each of the hospitals, all 6, and we all stood together. So we all stood there together and we'd go to meetings together. You know, the medical director of Medway, who weren't going to get a service by this point, came with me to some of the most difficult meetings to stand and be supportive that this was still the right thing to do for patients. But what I wasn't expecting was that it would get very political, and it was political campaign group that got the funding and took us to the High Court, and it was really disappointing. But you just have to carry on because it was the right thing to do. So completely concur with your point.
Thanks both. So I'm just going to make a very quick reflective comment to that. We as clinicians in clinical senates can make a powerful clinical argument, but we must not underestimate the power of the arguments of others, and particularly the human factors that get introduced into some of these change proposals. Human beings are curious creatures and often need strong persuasion, not necessarily just the clinical argument. And I think your points are very well made. I'm going to go to Kathy and then to Andrew.
Thank you very much for this experience today. It's my first sort of session joining the Northwest Clinical Senate, and I'm a GP by background. So Rachel, I just wanted to ask you a question about the sort of reflections on lessons learned and citizen or public engagement, and really actually did you probably we all do as clinicians underestimate how much resource we need to ring fence to engage citizens proactively?
Yeah, to be honest with you, I think in this case, I think we did genuinely very well, actually. We got a commendation in the court for our public consultation, and that doesn't happen very often. The judge particularly commented just how broad a consultation and all the years of pre-engagement work we'd done. What we didn't do, and actually John has just said in the chat, campaign groups, that's the bit. I don't know what else we could have done, but we could have done something surely, because the political angle and the campaign group politically, we didn't deal with that well enough, and didn't definitely put enough time and focus. And I saw somebody further up said you've got a landscape. I think Shrewsbury isn't a dissimilar landscape. My honest advice, if you've got a landscape like that, is do everything you can do before you get anywhere near a public consultation with those campaign groups. It was particularly difficult. But our public, actually, if you look at what we did, we employed a company who do all of this stuff, and they were absolutely outstanding. And again, don't skimp on that. Don't try and do it yourselves unless you've got lots of experience of doing it, because it is an art, actually, to go and really genuinely engage with the public. Is an art, and it's an important part of it. But I think campaign groups is where we didn't go. We didn't do what we should have done, and it bit us on the bottom later on.
Thanks. I mean, these are really rich and interesting conversation. I think really important takeaway messages coming out here. Andrew.
Yes, just building on that, 2 experiences. Some years ago, I had a very unhappy time in a public overview and scrutiny meeting where we got absolutely pilloried and abused about a plan to close an inpatient paediatric unit and move services to another one 4 miles away. And a week later, I got a phone call from the leader of the council who invited me for a cup of tea and said, I'm terribly sorry about all that, but you do realise we had to let people beat you up. Now they'll go away feeling happy, and we'll see what we can do to make this happen. And it did happen. Lesson learned, exactly as Rachel has said, we probably should have done more to head that off before it got to the public meeting. And later on, in the light of that experience, in a very difficult situation, we invited the leaders of the campaign group to come and meet the Senate review team once we realized that what was going on. And they were very agitated and very cross. But I think in the end, it helped considerably that they just felt they'd been listened to. And I think in both cases, rightly or wrongly, these people felt they'd not been listened to. And I think that's a really important lesson. The other sub point is, going back to the first example, it was actually driven by staff. And I'd underestimated. We were thinking about what was in the public interest, but these people who were pushing the campaign group were thinking about what was in their interest and what would happen to their jobs. And that was an angle I hadn't considered.
Thanks, Andrew. Gerard.
Hi, yeah, I was just going to say, we are starting to see a bit more action from staff members. So, I mean, everybody's seen the Keep Wythenshawe special one, the Manchester one, where the clinicians came together. But actually, the one over in Lancashire, we had a very interesting problem because we had a group of the clinicians who were saying the ED would not be safe to be open 24/7. We had a campaign group who were demanding it be open 24/7. And then we also had the nice political issue because we had the Speaker of the House of Commons, Lindsay Hoyle, who was the MP for that area. And whilst we can't prove it, this was at the same time as the Health and Care Bill was needing to go through the House of Commons fairly rapidly. And obviously the Speaker holds the ability for anybody in government to do that. So we had almost a perfect storm of problems there that came around. But we actually on that occasion managed to get the campaign group to speak to the clinicians. And when the clinicians were really clear, this is going to be unsafe, the campaign group backed down because they said, we don't really want to put this kind of pressure on our clinicians. And the only other thing I was going to say was that we have now started to look a lot more at pre-engagement work with campaign groups. If you know there's a campaign group out there and you know they're going to bring issues, pre-engagement is a great way to kind of find out, is it possible to get anywhere with them, or do we have to make doubly certain our process is absolutely perfect because they're just going to keep going? If you can bring them into the tent, fantastic. Sometimes they still go off after that, irrespective of what you've done, but at least you've done the most you can.
Thanks, Gerard. So, I mean, I think the takeaway message is the earlier you start the conversation, the better. And I think also Rachel's point as well, engaging with local authorities very early and trying to bring them on side seems to be absolutely crucial here. Any other quick points? We've just got the dying embers of the meeting, and we've got a mentee, I think, just to give feedback. John, is it?
Yeah, I was involved in a consultation about a doctor's surgery moving to an area, and they had the consultation at 9 o'clock in the morning when everybody was either going to work or mothers were taking the babies to school. At 9:15, they decided that no one was turning up, it was a waste of time, and then bagged all the food that they brought and took it out with them. So how was that a consultation? We kept asking them that, and he was saying, oh no, we put the event on, it's not our problem if people don't see.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, that's not a credible engagement exercise, is it, John? And yeah, thanks for that, because I think these real world examples of why things don't work are absolutely crucial for us to understand. Okay, so we've got 2 minutes left. I'm going to draw us to a close. I want to get everybody away and out of the door on time, as it were. So again, thank you very much to my co-chair colleagues for today. Thanks once again to the Senate management team working hard away in the background. And thank you to our stellar speakers. We hope to be able to share, I think, the presentations from today. And there's quite a few offers of ongoing engagement from speakers today. So I'm sure that they will be inundated with further questions and comments. So thank you to everybody for participating. As I say, we topped out at well over 60. And just to say that at difficult times, I really do appreciate the time that people have put in this afternoon to take out from their busy schedules. It's really very much appreciated, and the contribution everybody makes to the work of the clinical senates across the whole of the north of England is very much appreciated by us all. So thank you very much for your work and commitment. Please do feedback now via the Menti, which we'll leave hopefully, Sarah, for folk to dial into, and we'll reflect on that. As I say, there is a further